And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 182. Today is a critique week, so we've had 4 people send in images so I'll be giving feedback on those. If you happen to be watching live, then make sure you leave a comment, say hello, let me know where you're from, let me know what part of the country you're in, what the weather's doing, all that kind of stuff. Not what part of the country, what part of the world. So yes, leave some chat and we'll make a start. So yes, welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Hoping this time I don't have the squeaky voice. Suddenly realised I didn't properly check the settings before I set off. So yes, today we have, it's a week of critique and feedback. So we've had 4 different people send in images. I'm going to go through the images, give them feedback, and hopefully that will give you all ideas for your own photography. Because generally speaking, what tends to bother one photographer tends to bother most of us on one level or another. I can see we've got a few comments in already. Pat says, calm and still here in Minehead. April says, greetings everyone from a sunny Long Island, New York. Susan says, hello from a wild and wet Kukubri, another hot chocolate kind of day. Robert says, howdy all from Texas, cloudy and chilly. Sandra says, hi everyone from a cloudy, windy Birmingham, back from the sun and warmth of Mexico, and now recovered from jet lag. Whoa, there's a bit of a, that must be a bit of a, well, kind of, yeah, culture clash almost, you know, just the kind of coming back, you know, the warmth of Mexico back to the cool dampness of the UK. Meg says, afternoon everyone. Janet says, hello from a sunny and relatively warm Mississauga, the first weekend of sun since November. Whoa. And already more sun in February than the entire month of January as of midday yesterday. And we're only on, what, the 4th of February? Well, so it must have been a pretty grim January. My heart goes out to you there, Janet. April says, bet you got some great pics, Sandra. Oh, and John says, hello once again. A nice day here in Ohio. Excellent. Right, so what we're going to do, oh yeah, where I will start is, I wanted to say about Smug Points. So we got to the, oh, one sec, where am I here? Yeah, I want to do that. We got to the Smug Points system in January. The total Smug Points are, our winner for January is Janet from Mississauga, who managed to accumulate a massive 80 Smug Points, followed closely by Robert at 70 and April at 65. So well done, Janet. Hoping that worked. Yes, so basically, Janet is our SMUGEE of the month, or smugger of the month. Would it be a smugger or a SMUGEE? Not entirely sure which. At the moment, I haven't kind of worked out whether there are any prizes associated with this, but at the very least, you get the label of SMUGEE of the month, I think, Janet. So congratulations to you. What I have decided, what I think I will do at the very least, certainly until I can work out whether there's any kind of monthly award beyond pure kudos, although don't underestimate the kudos, that's certainly worth something, is I think when we get to 3 months, what I will do is the person who has accumulated the most points in 3 months will get to do a podcast. I'll do a podcast specifically for them. So if they then send me 4 photos, we can deal with very specific points of what that particular person has sticking points with, struggles with, or would just like really more information on. So any aspect of photography, it becomes, we'll do a podcast dedicated specifically to you and how the areas you would like to improve in. And then at the end of what we'll also do then is accumulatively at the end of the year, I will do a mentoring session. I'll do a 1 or 2 hours mentoring session with the person who's accumulated the most points. We can, if you happen to be living locally enough to be able to do it in person, we can do that. Or if you happen to be living further afield, we can do this via Zoom or Skype or some other kind of video call. So, worth accumulating the smug points for, but in the meantime, you certainly can feel smug for the kudos for gaining the points in the first place. So, well done there, Janet. Right, so a couple more comments. Oh yeah, Janet says thanks, and lots of people congratulating Janet on the smug points. Excellent. Right, okay, so let's make a start. What are we going to talk about? So, like I say, it's a feedback week this week. I put out the call and said if you wanted to have a go at, if you wanted some direct feedback on a particular picture, then to send it to me. Because if this is called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, and so if you want to improve your understanding with photography, this is the place to be. And these particular sessions are the place where you can get absolute direct feedback on your particular photos. You can watch as many videos as you like online about all sorts of different aspects of composition, about technical, about aspects of the camera, about editing, all this kind of stuff. But then you have to translate it through to your own photos, and that's great, except sometimes you can see how it works with somebody else's photo, but you're kind of stuck with your own. You're not necessarily sure what's standing in the way, what are your blind spots happen to be. And this is where something like this direct feedback on your own photography can be extraordinarily useful. So, as this is a major part of these podcasts, part of what I'm also doing is I'm giving up 25 smug points to each person who sent in an image for critique that I then look at on these. So all contributions. So all the smug points are based around the idea of contributions to the podcast, making it a better place for everybody else who's viewing. So if you're leaving comments here, you get 5 smug points for turning up and saying hello. If we do a challenge and you stick an image in for the challenge, you get 10 points for sticking in a challenge, 25 points for putting in for feedback, and 30 points if you drag a friend along and that they comment and start taking part too. So Robert actually got 30 points last week for his fellow Robert from Texas, the Dallas Camera Club. So that's the way the smug points work if you wish to accumulate them. So let's make a start on today's then. So what we're going to start, I want to start here with is Nurije. Now, Nurije sent, let me find if I can do that, and then one day I will get these technicals right, but obviously not today. So let's flip over to this one. This is what I wanted to say. So this is Nurije's original photo, and in fact, actually, what I should do is send in, put up this one. Actually, just do that. It's easier. This was Nurije's edited photo, and so she's managed to capture this beautiful little robin sitting on a fence, and she says, "Hi Kim. Sending this one in for feedback, please. Apart from straightening it, I played a bit with the colours. I even tried to convert it into black and white, but I'm not sure that worked. Haven't really done anything else. I like the frost on the fence. It's a shame that I can't see more detail of the robin itself. Is there anything at all you can do to fix that? Thank you." Okay, so what we've got here then is Nurije's seen the robin on the fence. She's got her photo, she's taken her photo, she's zoomed in on it. Just trying to see if I can get anything out of the information on the image. I can't see how much she zoomed in it, but I would guess she's probably zoomed in as much as the camera would allow. And she's managed to get this photo. Now the original she sent, like I say, is this, so not much bigger, so she's not really cropped in much. So I think first of all, let's just open this with, if I actually make sure I open the right kind of Photoshop, because it will automatically seems to open on my beta version, which is messing me about somewhat. So let's pull this into here, and yes, the first thing we want to do is straighten it. Now interestingly here, there's 2 ways we can straighten this photo. We can straighten it, which is the way Nurije did, I think, which is to crop it. Hang on, instead of generative expand, let's do background default. So we can straighten it so we make the fence level. But interestingly, the angle she's at, the fence, top of the fence level, means that the planks actually sit at the diagonal. So there's obviously been a slight angle. So the other way of straightening it is not to essentially straighten the horizon, but to straighten the verticals. And then that way you end up with a very slight diagonal on the fence. And I don't think that's too bad. There's just a sort of slightly interesting way of doing it. Then we want to kind of line up where we're going to place our little robin, and probably because the robin's looking to the left, and if you were to do a sort of general rule of thirds-ish, you'll probably sort of have it over this way, so you've got more space in front of the robin and where it's looking, and maybe just pull that in a little bit to give it a slightly more. So what I might do is crop it something like that. I think just give it a little bit more space. And then, having cropped that, I would just use this little tool, the spot healing tool, to run down the edge of that and fill in the bit of sky. So now we've got the crop. What we're up against essentially is the main problem of the fact that this is underexposed. There's not enough light falling on the robin. If I go to the levels, what we can see here over on the right is there's a big gap in the histogram. So if I grab that to the left and I pull that up, you can see the whole thing brightens up. But it gets to there, and although the sky's brightened, and this first bit coming up here is bits of the sky and maybe bits of the wood, we take that up, take it up to we've got another one there for where the wood is, and we've got another one here, and at this point we're sort of blowing out all the highlights completely. But a chunk of the robin is still too dark. Now part of the problem here, and it's an old problem, it's one of the things that you often end up with when you're taking photos, and there's a larger, brighter area than your subject. Your camera will auto-expose for the brighter area. So there's more sky, and the sky is brighter than the robin and the fence. So the camera is automatically exposing for the sky behind it. What that means is, because the sky is quite bright, it darkens it down in the exposure. So anything that's a bit darker becomes a lot darker. So in this case, the robin and the fence have become underexposed, and that's where your starting problem is. And in essence, if you realise this is happening, then the thing to do is to actually, given the fact that the robin is sitting on the fence, so you won't have to worry about the focus issue, is to tip the camera down, focus and expose for the fence just below it, because if you don't, so that if the scene is filled with the fence, you'll get a better level of exposure. Hold your finger halfway down on the shutter, get the exposure, and then bring it up, line it up and go click. Now, obviously, there's a time thing involved here, which means the time you're doing that, it's quite possible the robin might fly away. But in essence, your way of trying to deal with the camera automatically underexposing your subject is, because it's adjusting itself for the sky behind, is to make sure it's focused, the exposure setting is auto-focusing, or auto-exposing rather, on a darker area. You're filling the screen with a much more sympathetic to the subject part of the area. Otherwise, you need to kind of go into manual and start playing around with overrides. So, having understood that at the point that you're taking it, you weren't able to do that. Is there anything we can do to rescue any of the information out of this? Because what we've seen is if we just take the levels and we lighten it, we end up kind of blowing everything out before we start getting into the shadows here, and that's no good. Well, to be honest, we are kind of limited. No, didn't mean to duplicate that. Let's just get rid of those levels for a moment. Go back to here. I will duplicate this copy. Let's go to filter, camera raw filter. And what I'm going to see here is, now this, you sent me the original, which is a JPEG. This is where we find out the real difference between a JPEG and a RAW, because the RAW file contains all the information in the original file that when the photo was taken. The JPEG compresses it. This is why your RAW file might be 20 megabytes big, but your JPEG is only 4 or 5 megabytes big. The JPEG doesn't hold as much information. It's a compressed file. And what it does is the algorithm sort out, it goes, oh, that's dark, we'll get rid of the subtleties of grades, that's too bright, we'll lose that. Now, in the RAW file, quite often you can draw extra information out of the shadows, or extra information down from the highlights that you might not be able to do out of the JPEG. And because this is a JPEG and not a RAW, it means if we go in here and I pull the shadows up, so I can pull up the shadows, and what we can see is we're lightening up, and we are now getting more detail out of the robin. I've taken the shadows as high as I can. I might just nudge the exposure up a little bit, and now we can see more of the robin. The other problem that we do have though now is that there's a lot of noise. There's still not huge amounts of detail in here. Now, like I said, we've got more noise, so I can go down to the detail here. I can go to the noise reduction, get rid of a bit of the color noise reduction, noise reduction. Now, but the more I smooth that out to get rid of the noise, the more, there's not a lot of detail here in the first place, and the more I smooth it, the more detail I lose completely as well. So you're kind of in this tricky situation that I don't want to have too much noise, but I can't smooth it too much either. Now maybe if I go up to my effects here and I play around with clarity and texture. Texture, I can bring in a little bit more texture, bring in a little bit more clarity, and that's kind of really sharpening. But again, we're introducing more noise by doing this. So we go back to the detail and we try and nudge the noise reduction up again. And you can see it's this kind of constant battle backwards and forwards about trying to get the right level. So at a small level like this, maybe at a distance on a small web photo, you can just about get away with that from that. But the moment we start zooming in, we realize the detail just isn't quite there. So we are kind of limited. One of the other things that you can do, just a little touch here to highlight it, is if I look right up in the eye, you're just starting to get a catch light in the eye in here. And I'd kind of want to lift that a little bit more. What I will just do here, I'll create a separate layer. I'll go to white, and I'm going to go down here. I'll take that down to something like 40%-ish. I will do a large bit, and then I'll just take that down a little bit more. Just do a little bit of stripe in there. Now, that in itself is too bright. But because I've done it on a separate layer, I can now play with the opacity of the separate layer, take that out, nudge it up, something like that. In this case, about 50% of what I've got. And what we find is having that little catch light in the robin's eye, which was there already, so what we're just exaggerating it a bit, suddenly adds just a tiny little bit of extra life to the sense of the robin. It's one of these things we've talked before about in portraiture, the eyes being the most important part of a face, and that if there's a little catch light in the eye, it adds a little bit of extra life. When there's no catch lights at all, the eyes can come across as quite dead. So a little bit of reflection in there. So that's pretty much about as far as I think I can really go with this one, Nurije. I hope that gives you sort of some ideas. In a way, kind of what you're limited here with is your camera. When you're on maximum zoom, but I think the camera you've used, I was looking it up from you got a Sony HX90V or something like that, and it's a pocket camera with a kind of built-in zoom on it. But it's because it's a small camera, your sensor isn't going to be huge on it. It might give 18 megapixels, but it's a small camera, so it's a smaller sensor, so those pixels are more compressed. So that means there's a limited amount of detail you're going to get, especially at full zoom. So then you're kind of underexposed as well, because it's exposed for the sky. And so because it's underexposed, it's then gone, the darks, too much of the robin has gone into the darks. And then because it's JPEG and you don't have a raw file, you aren't able to extract any of that information back out of the shadows. So that means there's a limited amount you can kind of do. So in the end, lovely to be able to capture the robin. The shame has been, in essence, it's the limitation of the camera that you've got to be able to bring out much more detail than what I've already done. We can go in, we can tweak a little bit with bringing up the shadows, we can tweak a bit with texture and contrast, but ultimately there's a sort of a limit as to how far you can go. So something like this now it's fine at a web size photo, but certainly wouldn't be good enough to print up. But anyway, I hope that gives you some insights and ideas there, Nurije. So many thanks for sending that one in. I hope it's given some ideas to everybody else too. Okay, we have a few comments here. April says, don't forget to hit the like button. This is true. If you have, make sure, if you haven't subscribed already, make sure you subscribe to the Kim Ayres channel here on YouTube, but also make sure you click like down here on this video as well. The algorithms on YouTube always like a like, so that helps. Where do we go? April says, what a cute robin. We don't have those in New York, but the American robins are plentiful here. Love that song. Oh, Robert number 2 from Texas has joined us. Good morning. I almost forgot. It's time to set your alarm. Build it into your weekly your weekly routine there, Robert. Nadia says, hi everyone. Sorry I'm late. Robert says, however, I did forget to submit an image for review. Don't worry, just watch other images for review and maybe you can get one in for future weeks. April says, you don't always have to. Oh, but he did have one wanted some feedback on. Okay, perhaps for next time then, yes. Sandra says, nice fluffy Robin. Janet says, would a fill flash have helped at the time of shooting? A flash, now that's a tricky one, because the fact is the bird, there's a timing thing here, which is always with wildlife, which is you've then got to remember to do it. But yeah, say you had a flash, you could shoot it off. A little bit kind of depends on how far away you are. Because if the bird is off in the tree or far off on the fence and you are shooting from quite a distance, then the flash essentially might not make it. Even though it feels like it's quite dull, the fact that the sky was clear blue means it was quite a bright day. And the shadow in there, dark because of the way the camera's exposed it, but actually that amount of daylight will tend to overpower most flashes. And certainly the little built-in one that you might have on a small camera. In an ideal situation, maybe. The other thing with a flash, though, also you have to remember, is that the flash is also gives you the light from exactly the same direction as the camera. Now, if the natural daylight is coming from a different direction, then that's going to look a little bit false. Ideally, in an ideal situation, you have a off-camera flash set off to one side, so you're getting sculpted light. But the chances of being able to do that outside of a kind of very controlled studio or even outdoor studio environment is very unlikely, especially with wildlife. I mean, I think there are some wildlife photographers who, when they've got a setup, say like you're shooting squirrels or something like that, and you've already set up a place, you know where they come, you've already set up food in place where you know they're likely to scamper down the tree and come there for it. Or if you have a bird table, perhaps, where you know the birds are coming, then perhaps you can set up the flash, you can set up the lighting in advance of, so that when the bird lands on the bird table or the squirrel comes down to eat the nuts or whatever, at that point you can fire the flash off. Whether the animal will be spooked by the flash or not and then maybe never come again, I don't know. I don't know enough about. I know some animals, like horses, for example, don't register a flash. Other animals, I think, do. So that's one of those things you would have to research. But interesting question, that one, Janet. Right, okay, so where do we go next? Next up, then, I think we are going to go to Viji. So Viji sent in, right, let me just find this photo. Viji sent in this photo of a spider, and she said, I took several shots of this spider, but I was a bit afraid to go near it. I was using a bridge camera and zoomed in. What do you think about the angle? And then she also sent me a black and white edited version as well. Now, to an extent, what we've got here, our starting problem tends to be the same problem that Nurije had as well. You're using a bridge camera, a slightly smaller camera, you've gone to maximum zoom on it, and what this means is we're lacking a certain amount of detail. And when we zoom in here, what we can see is there's a fair amount of noise, there's hints of detail, but we're not really getting the kind of texture and detail like you get in a really good macro shot, where you've got a nice lens, you're a bit closer, you can get in close and you get that real, that wonderful sort of sense of texture. Now the colour looks a bit odd. This yellow looks a kind of greenish yellow. Now what I don't know with this as well is this because it's got a sort of semi-transparent body and the light's coming through it? I've seen spiders like that, but this sort of green yellow looks, well, it looks weird to me. Having said that, I don't know what the spiders are like in India. So it may well be the actual natural colour. It's a sort of strange crop size, this as well. So I don't know whether you've already cropped this before sending me. So if you had the original photo, it would be useful if you could send me that rather than if you've already started to edit it. This sort of feels to me like it's already been edited a little bit. And so that gives, because you've edited it, if you have, then that gives me less options to be able to explore to find an answer for you. I think the angle's a nice one. I think, we've got the nice diagonal of the legs. We've got all the picture sort of seeping out. What I would say, again, is because there's a limit to how far you can go in on the detail, is I think you kind of, if when you're doing a picture of a spider, you're either looking to enhance the subject, in which case the spider, in which case we really would like a little bit more texture and detail. But given here, these blacks are very, very black, and there's nothing there really to bring any detail out of. You're running into exactly the same problem we were talking about with Nurije, as in this is a JPEG where the raw file would have been so much better. You've been using a bridge camera, I'm assuming it doesn't shoot raw. With the raw file here, we might have been able to draw more detail out of the shadows, and that might have given us more options to just sort of play around with the spider. So what I would say here then is actually you maybe want to make slightly more of the spider in the web. And I'd be tempted in that way that I often talk about, where I say very often most photos tend to be improved either by zooming in or by stepping out a bit, because it changed depending on whether you're wanting to make more of the subject or the textures within the subject, or you're wanting to make more of the setting. And in this case, because we can't go in, I then get tempted to say, well, let's move out. So we'll go to generative expand just so we can get a sense of this. But in this case, what I'd be tempted, first of all, I prefer the idea of that, because that square but not quite square never fully fits. I tend to feel go landscape, go portrait, go square. The square and a bit, very rarely work. I mean, it works for some pictures, but quite often not. So with something like this, what I'm actually thinking is, I think if you have more of the web, and so the spider sort of sat roughly about there. So I'll hit enter on that and see what options it gives us. But our basic idea is to try and hopefully make more of the spider within its setting, and actually make, because webs are fascinating in themselves and the beautiful patterning that you get. So to have something so is it going to show us, what's it going to give us? Oh, there we go. Yeah, you see, I think for my taste, given us a couple of different options, that one, I don't know what else might have been there. I quite like that one where there's sort of yellowish bokeh in the background here, which then starts to echo a little bit of the yellow that's in the body of the spider as well. So I think instantly, really, just by changing your crop, having a slightly larger sense so that you're getting more of the web itself, gives you a sort of slightly better composition with something like this. And then the angle is a nice angle. We've got the lovely kind of diagonals, the way that it's, which, as we talked before about the idea that diagonals always kind of add a little bit more energy into a picture. So that's kind of about the best I can think of with that. Black and white conversions are always difficult. If you just straightforwardly go to hue saturation and drag it down, it's kind of limited. Everything kind of becomes a bit flat. With something like this, I'll just put all that onto one layer. I'd be more tempted to do some, well, even if you do a black and white bit here, and then you can play around with individual sliders. So your yellow, you can make the, you can bring that up a little bit more and just sort of make more of the fact that create a little bit more contrast with the body. Reds, got your legs, you can kind of bring those up a little bit. Not sure what, the greens aren't doing anything. Cyans just fractionally in the background, would leave that. But it gives you, the point being that basically if you play around with the colour slider versions, that you can up and down a little bit more of some of these different colour schemes, colour levels within your black and white to give you the contrast where you want to have the contrast. So if you go in black and white, I would always consider that notion rather than just doing a blanket desaturate or gradient map. So hope that gives you some ideas there, Viji. Oh, April says that is cool. Looks like a bumblebee spider. Sandra says, I like the water droplets on the web. April says, looks like a banana spider, but not quite from the south. If so, they are not poisonous. I have no idea whether the spiders are similar in America as they are in India. Quite possibly not. No idea which ones are poisonous or not. I think I'd probably be avoiding them if I was, but certainly in a kind of, southern India, sort of tropical-ish, I'd probably avoid them. Right, okay. Well, actually, Viji did send in another photo, just which I do. I was only going to deal with one, but I will actually say something about this one because where she said she took this one of a tree. Is the tree from the correct angle, or should I have taken from the other side? I kind of like the light, shadows and mist. The other side, it was a cottage, and but I liked the coconut palm. Let me know what you think about the composition. And I think here, what I did want to quickly say with this one is you've definitely taken it from the right side. If moving around the tree to a different angle from the tree would have, first of all, given you a cottage in the background that you didn't want, but also it would have changed where the light has come from. This misty day, what you've got is you've got the backlight. We talk so often that the backlight is the photographer's secret weapon. And on a misty day, absolutely, 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 get the sun behind the subject. Now, it can either be directly behind like this, or maybe even sort of 45 degrees behind, 45 degrees the other side, but you want the sun behind the subject. And when you've got a mist, you get all these beautiful, beautiful layers and silhouettes and layers of silhouettes and everything else. And I think there's something really quite magical about this photo. I do like this photo a lot. Again, the only thing that I tend to feel is I would take the crop slightly differently. I'm not going to expand out, but just bringing that down a fraction, whether you want to make sure you've got the top in, or can you lose the top? Yeah, you know, it's actually, there's a bit here where I kind of feel, bring it down a bit, bring it up a bit, almost, yeah, cinematic. That does it for me. Might vary from person to person, but I think then you get something like that, and that feels that little bit closer in, cropping in, but again, that kind of landscape version. Maybe you don't need to go the full cinematic like I have here, but certainly a slightly more landscape, I think, gives a better sense of the space. But the light behind, I think, works particularly well. So I hope that gives you a little bit of useful information there, Viji. Right, okay, let me close that, minimize that, close that. And comments. Susan says, I love that soft backlight, VG. April says, mist and palm trees, nice. And Meg says, I really like the curves in the tree. Excellent. So, quick reminder then that if you happen to find these podcasts useful, interesting, or entertaining, and you would like to support them in some ways, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. And of course, don't forget to invite your friends along as well. Let's grow this wonderful little community of ours. Okay, right, so next up then we're going to go to Maria. Now, complications here. Maria sent this one, but she put it into the Facebook group. Now, I don't know whether... So, unfortunately, what's happened is it's been a very low resolution photo, but we'll talk about what she says anyway. She says, hello, Kim. It's been a bit of a time for me, because I do remember Maria's has put images in before, but I think it's a good couple of years ago when she last did. She says, but I'm trying to get back into my photography. Would love your feedback. This shot was recent from November of this past year while spending holidays with family. It was dusk, cold, no one was around by the time we made it there. Apparently, George Washington and his men went through here, slept with minimum comfort, cold and hungry. The original is in colour, but remembering how I felt, black and white seemed more appropriate. Also, not sure if you noticed, there is someone in the photo. I had no idea until I looked at it on my computer. So, unfortunately, this is as big as the image that you've sent. And I would ask you, Maria, in the future to try and make sure, if you can send me a bigger copy of this image. If you've got the original, it's high resolution, email it to me. But even the biggest size that you can onto Facebook certainly gives me more options to crop. Because we've already started here, the minute I even get to fill the screen, we're starting to get pixelated. So that limits options to what I can do. It also makes it things like, are there people in it? I don't know. Looking at this, it looks like maybe those are people shapes, or maybe they're not. Difficult to actually, as I move right in, maybe they're not. Maybe that's just bits and pieces sitting in the background. Not enough resolution for me to see whether there is something else here. So, but Maria put a couple. I asked her if she had anything where she could show me the originals. She sent in this one, which was even smaller. Again, it looks like you're probably doing this from your phone. You've done a screenshot and sent it across, and it's even smaller because now we've only got this amount of pixels. And and you can see the resolution disappears completely with this. Sorry, you sent me this one as well, which is better picture, higher resolution, but it's a long one, and it's obviously a different one on your phone where you cut off the back end, so it's a little bit tricky. To go back to this, so what you've done is you've done a black and white with a slight sepia tone crop. Given the fact that obviously the colouring on the day, as you say, it's a dull day, there's not a lot going on, then maybe concentrating on the tones by going black and white isn't a bad way of doing it. The only thing I can really suggest, like I say, it's kind of tricky here because there's not enough information for me to properly work with. But at a quick glance, what I would say is to think a little bit more about the crop, and really what's the interesting part of the story here. What this picture is about the barn and the trees. You know, we've got these dead trees, and the textures, we've got the fence, we've got the path. But there's a lot of sky here which isn't doing anything. In the original photo, it's dull and overcast. With the conversion, it just ends up an absolute plain. So in a way, I would really think about, I would just you could crop out most of that. I wouldn't crop it all out because that would just look a bit odd, but you only need kind of enough sky to know that there is sky there, and then anybody looking at it is going to sort of fill in the blanks afterwards. So now at this point, we maybe don't need to be quite as wide as this. We can kind of maybe crop in a little bit here. I like the way the fence starts to run down the hill, so maybe I would keep a bit of that fence, and maybe we just sort of bring in a little bit from the trees on this side. We allow this path to run up that kind of line of third of the way across the screen, something like that. And then at this point, I think you've probably got a slightly more interesting crop. Again, conversion to black and white. If I had a better picture, a bit like I was talking about with Viji. Well, okay, let me show you then just on the other picture that you said. Where's it gone? Right, so let's open this one in Photoshop. Let me just talk about, again, a quick conversion with black and white, because what we've got here is we have the red barn. And if I just go hue saturation and I desaturate, you can't really tell, there's no real difference between the barn and the grass. We can't tell the difference between red and green. It's the same tonal grades. Whereas if I go to use the black and white filter, I've got more options here. And if I want, I can lighten up the reds of the barn, or I can darken down the reds of the barn, and maybe I can lighten up the greens and yellow of the grass. So you see, by doing this, I can make the grass brighter and the barn darker. Or I can go in the opposite direction, make the grass a little bit darker and make the barn a little bit lighter. Either way, you're creating a little bit more contrast. So the way you convert to black and white can make quite a significant difference to the outcome and the mood and the feel of the photo. So first of all, you're thinking about the crop that you've got. Do you need as much sky if there's nothing actually happening in the sky? What's the important part? Where do you want, do you want, like in this case, the path leading up to the barn, as it's only the front part of the barn which is really being seen. With this one, the back part of the barn and the way the fence runs down, starts to run down the slope a little bit, becomes an important part of the composition. But as you can see here, that depending on how you will play with it, with the conversion as to the relationship between the barn and the grass, you want to be able to have the options. So I hope that gives you a few ideas, a couple of little insights there to play around with, Maria. So your key points here are then your crop, what's important in the story of what you're trying to tell. It's the narrative. It's kind of, I've said quite often, with, what are the key aspects? What's the story of the photo? And then the different aspects of the cropping and what else is in it is either enhancing that story or detracting from the story. Is the story about the barn? Is the story about the surrounds? Is the story about how the barn sits in its surrounds? Or is it about the woodwork? All these kind of things will affect how close in you get, how far out you come. And something like, in this case, the sky, which wasn't very interesting, we would crop out on a different day with a dramatic sky. You might want to make more of it. And then when you come to converting to black and white, there's a number of different ways to do that, and it's worth exploring them so that you can get the levels of contrast you want. So hope that helps. Where were we? Oh, John says, good shot, Viji. April says, I like the red building. I would have gotten in closer to it, and I like it in colour with the red barn. Right, okay. Let's move on then to last one I'm going to talk about today is from Doriana, and then I will tell you what we're doing over the next 2 weeks as well. So stick around. Now, interesting, actually, this one from Doriana actually sort of leads into next week's in a way, because next week I'm going to be talking about still life, but I'll go into more detail on that afterwards. So Doriana sent in this one, and she says, I was playing around with petals on one of the flowers. One flower, the leaves fell off, and this gave me an idea to cut the other 2 flowers and spread the petals. I struggled with lighting. Image taken by a window on a sunny day. Is the composition okay? Okay, so just to talk, a quick talk about the lighting. Yeah, if you're near a window and it's a bright day outside, that's always lovely lighting. If the sun's coming directly through the window, that might be too harsh, but if it's a north-facing window or the light's sort of pointing to a different part of the room, then you're just getting the window becomes essentially like a giant softbox. So that's always, certainly for still life, that's quite a good starting point, is natural window light. If you are, now you said you were struggling with the light, maybe that, but sometimes if you're too far away, or there's other things, like it might be a bright day but there's trees near the window, so you're not getting as much light as you would like, then what you maybe want to do is put the camera on a tripod or rest it on a couple of books or something, but keep the camera steady, and then slow down your shutter speed if you're struggling to get enough light in. So in the image you sent me here, where have I got? Yes, so you're using an f5.6 hundredth of a second, an ISO 640. So an ISO 640 is kind of beginning to push it a little bit in terms of the quality. It means that generally speaking, when you zoom in, you're going to start getting a bit noisy. If you can get, the closer you can get the lower number you can get with your ISO, the closer you can get towards 100, the better in terms of quality. But it does tend to mean that you need more light. So in that case, slowing down. Now you've done 100th of a second. If you've gone down to a 50th of a second, a 40th of a second, a 20th of a second, a 10th of a second, that would have allowed you a 100 ISO and given you as much light as you would have wanted. If you're going down particularly slow, once you get down kind of below 10th of a second, the act of pressing the shutter, even if you're on a tripod, might wobble the camera slightly. So at that point, the suggestion is always to stick it on a 2-second timer. And then press it, and then that gives the camera a couple of seconds to stop wobbling before it then takes the photo. So that's one of the ways to get around handshake or camera shake. So next then onto the actual picture itself, and for that you've asked about the idea of the composition. And I think it's a nice start. I like the idea of it. I think it's interesting. Now, what we've got, one picture, one of the flowers has sort of less petals than the others. So with that, you can kind of decide whether you want to have, because you've got 3 together, you've got 3 in a line. Now, generally speaking, when you've got something like this, your choice is you can either put them on the same line, like you have here, or you can have them sort of maybe moved about slightly front or back, so maybe one or, the shape, you can create slightly different shapes with them. If you're doing that though, of course, what's going to happen is one might be more in focus than the other. So this is where you sort of start to play around. But the great thing about this kind of thing, and this is still life, is that you get the chance to play. You can go click, you can rearrange it, click, rearrange it, and you can play to your heart's content. You don't have to worry about it either being a robin that's going to fly away, a spider that's going to shoot off the run off the web, or changing conditions like the storm comes in or the sun sets, unless you're using window light. If you're then trying to tell a story with 3 identical photos, maybe you have one which has more petals, one with less, and one which has hardly any. So it becomes almost a kind of sequence or reverse sequence. Or you have, if you've got 2 with the same amount of petals and you put the one that doesn't sort of slightly more center, that's another way of playing with it. Another thing I would suggest, I mean, one of the things I noticed with this, actually, if I just zoom in a bit here, like that, I quite like this, you know. To reference back to our notion, what we were talking about last week and the week before, about filling the frame. Now, filling the frame doesn't just have to be on one image like this. I mean, strictly speaking, it's kind of playing around. But what I'm really talking about, this idea of that you don't necessarily have to have the outside of the picture here. If you do something like this, and we're not doing anything more than zooming in a little bit, so just cropping a little bit closer, then it does bring our attention to the flower that's in the middle. But these supporting ones feel like they spread out, and who knows? There could in fact be a row of 200 flowers. We don't know, but there's a feeling of the picture is then going beyond the boundaries of the edge of what you can see, and again, there's two different approaches to photography. One is where everything feels contained within the photo, and the other is where the photo feels like it's implying that there's more to see beyond the photo. And in this case, this would be, you're implying the notion that there's more beyond the edges of the photo. Sometimes you're taking a photo and you're implying that there's something more going to happen next or happen before. So you're doing a kind of temporal shift. Less so with something like this. But just by zooming in here, I think you end up with, it kind of becomes a little bit more interesting, I think. So composition wise, I would think about that. So you've got different levels of the amount of petals left on the flower. Do you want to create an actual sequence with that? Is one option. Do you want to have them at different depths away and distances from the camera? How you lay them out, put them in a semicircle or a curve, or the thing about this is that you have the option to kind of create lines, create shapes if you wish. So really something like this, play. And I can see you already have been playing. Another thing is, depending on the number of flowers you've got, is to really go for it with the petals. We've got some in the foreground, a few in the background, just enough as a kind of a bit of a taster. But if you had loads more scattered and really create a kind of a bed almost of these petals, that would give it a different feel. There's also the material that you've placed it on. You've got it on some kind of gauze or something like scrim or something here. Different kind of surfaces would change the mood and the feel of something like this. If you had this on a wooden oak table, oak wooden, or just kind of wooden table, that would give you one kind of feeling. Or follow Susan quite often does. I've seen her doing things with a kind of a black perspex as well, or a mirror or something like that. That would give a different kind of feel again. So lots to play with there, lots of different ideas. So your lighting then, primarily to go back to what you're asking about, your lighting, if you've got a certain amount of light which is kind of getting you there but you're not getting quite enough, at 100th of a second, I'm guessing you're hand holding it, but you don't necessarily have to hand hold it either with a tripod or, like I say, even resting it on a couple of books or something like that. You can then lower your shutter speed down to a 10th of a second or 20th of a second, which will give you more light, which will allow you for a lower ISO, and more flexibility really as to whether you wanted to play around with your aperture. But like I say, if you go for a very slow shutter speed, then it's usually worth putting the camera on a 2-second timer so that it's got time to stop wobbling between you clicking the shutter and taking the photo. So I hope that gives you a few ideas there, Doriana. Thank you very much for sending that in. We've got a couple more. April says, beautiful, I love this still life. Sandra says, pretty lilac flowers. April says, agreed, it does look closer up. Robert says, I like the composition, it looks like the flowers are melting into the fabric. Sandra says, I like the closer crop as you can see more detail in the flowers. Susan says, really like the scattered petals, Doriana, and the purple and yellow colours really complement one each other. And Robert says, maybe crop in from the opposite corners. Crop in from the opposite corners. Yeah, are you reflecting what I did, or is there a slight... I don't think I'm necessarily thinking which way, or are you thinking lengthwise? So I don't think I'm fully following you there, Robert. Or maybe you're just kind of referring to what I ended up doing in the first place. Okay, so that brings us to... So thank you very much to Maria, Doriana, Viji, and Nurije. Nurije, Doriana, Maria, and Viji for sending in the images, and to everybody who's been commenting. So next week then. So this is following... Next week is following on from... I think it was it Marilyn? I think it was Marilyn sent me an image talking about struggling with still life. And so what I decided to do was to revisit the idea of still life. Now, I did a podcast committed specifically to still life back in the first year I was doing these podcasts. Now, given the fact that we're coming up to year 4, this is over 3 years ago that I last did that. And I didn't realise it was as long ago as that. So I thought I will revisit the idea of still life, particularly artistic still life that comes down from the tradition of, when you think about the paintings like from the Dutch old masters or something like that, how do we create still life photos that are using the same lighting techniques, compositional techniques as the old masters were doing 300 or 400 years ago, or even for that matter, you find still life mosaics back in Roman temples as well. So the notion of still life goes back a long way. So what I thought I would do is revisit it. Quite often, there's a lot of online competitions have still life as one of the, a kind of fairly common kind of theme. And it also ties in one of my own ones on PhotoCrowd, still life one. I think I came first on one of the expert reviews on that. So I'm going to talk about that, talk about ways you can set up and considerations. And then that's all in setup ready for in 2 weeks' time. I will then do a still life challenge. So start having a think about that as well. So next week then I'm going to be talking about the notion of still life. I'll have a couple of spare slots for doing critique, feedback. Marilyn has already sent in one for that, so that's one taken up. So if somebody else is wanting to get in something for critique for next week, then send it to me as quickly as possible. You can either go to the Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, place it in there, or if you want to send it to me directly, then you can email me, kim@kimayres.co.uk. Just make sure you spell the Ayres right. And then, but send me the image. Tell me what your sticking points are, what kind of feedback you're looking for, what kind of help you feel you need, and then and if you can send me your original photo as well, even the raw file, then that gives me more options to be able to explore and find the best way to help you with it. So, hope that all helps. Robert said upper left, bottom right, or upper right and bottom left. So you're talking about kind of making it squarer then, more, or portrait. But either way, I think the point is that yes, you can go in and you can crop and you can play and deciding whether the shape, the aspect ratio, and how close in you are, uneven from the sides. Oh, okay. So rather than having the one in the middle, actually sort of doing a kind of a slight shift. It's a tricky one, actually. Okay, let's just flick back to here for a moment then. No, we didn't have that one. Let's... so, okay, let me go back and find Doriana's picture and see. It is one of those things. Now you're talking about it, Robert, I just want to kind of see what you mean. I think with something like this, because you've got three... Sorry. Flip over so you can see what I'm talking about. How we're going to crop. Now, what I was talking about here was the idea of essentially sort of zooming in and cropping it. Something like that. Now, there's a number of different ways you can crop. If you wanted to make it square, you could do, have it something like that. The question is would you go for an uneven crop so that you actually, what you do is say you had 2 filling it and 1 just on the outside, something like that. And I think it becomes slightly problematic if you're trying to fit 3 into the space. And given the fact that there are 3 running along this, I think if you do something like that, it just sort of looks a bit uneven. There's the rule of thirds. There's the idea of having your key thing off center, and that's fine. That works but then there's the other idea, which is where you're going to go for a kind of symmetry, not an absolute symmetry, but a sort of asymmetrical symmetry. And in this case, I think because of the starting point, if you crop it in any way other than keeping this middle one in the middle, then it's just going to look odd, so we can do that and that looks fine. But if we sort of put it like that, well, then you're making 2 out of it and you ignore 1. Now that's a different kind of composition, fine if you want to go that way, but I think the worst thing you can do is sort of have a bit of the third in like that, and because then it just feels like it's imbalanced and it's not really I think the mood and feel of it just doesn't work quite as well. So with something like this one, I think your starting point, you really need to have the middle one stays in the middle. Now you can swap them around and play around like that, and then if you're going to stretch out on one side, you kind of need to stretch out on the other. So if you're going over the edge on this side, you need to go over the edge on this side. If you're cropping to the middle on this one, I think you need to crop to the middle on that one. And if you're wanting to crop even further in, and you want a few of the petals on this side, then you need to have a few of the petals on that side. Either way, I think the starting point with this particular picture, if you're going to crop it, you need to keep that middle bit in the middle. I hope that makes sense, Robert, but always worth sort of playing around there with the crops. So yeah, hope that works. Right, so where were we? So back then to next week then will be the I'll be talking about the notion of still life, but I will have a couple of slots for feedback and critique. So if you have an image, get it sent in to me as soon as you can, because one of those is already taken up by Marilyn's. And then the week after, we are going to be doing a still life challenge. So chance for you to send in your still life. So start having a think about what you might do with that. And a still life is basically a collection of objects or flowers, or objects and flowers. Do a little bit of research. Go to some of these still life competitions that you've seen. What photos do you like? Go and take a look at some old paintings. See, are there things that you could replicate, you could do your own version of? I will be going into much more detail on this next week, but start having a think about it beforehand, because the challenge will be for 2 weeks' time. Okay, so I think that pretty much brings us to an end. If you found these podcasts useful, interesting, or entertaining, and you would like to support them, then do consider please buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. Thank you once again to everyone who sent in images. Thank you to everyone who has commented. And congratulations once again to Janet for being SMUGEE of the month for January. So what I will do is we can do a kind of start again on the Smug Points for the month. So maybe Janet will be leading the way again, or maybe we'll have a new SMUGEE of the month for February. But what I will do is I will keep a note of the accumulated points. So the one who has the most by the time we get to the end of March, we can then talk about the idea of having a dedicated podcast specifically for them, where they can put in a few photos, and we can, go in depth into something which is specifically to you. If you happen to be the lead, what is it that bothers you most about photography? What would you really like? Do you have particular photos? And we can just dedicate it precisely to the problems and difficulties that you've got to help elevate your photography to the next level. Right. That's it, I think. Right, what else do I need to do? I need to click on that, no, on that, and then have fun. See you all next week. Bye-bye.